Okay, good morning. Good morning. Welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us for another Small Talks presented by Think Small Institute. I'm Diane Halsey. I'm Senior Vice President of Family Engagement at Think Small, and I just want to welcome you this morning. Thanks for getting up early with us. I would also like to thank our visionary level sponsors, Sleep Number, Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Minnesota Foundation, and our builder level sponsor, Stone Ridge Software, for their generous contribution to this program. I also want to acknowledge that we have a current Think Small board member, Art Rolnick, is present with us this morning, as well as former board member, Bud Hayden. So welcome to you both. Thanks for joining us. So like me, you may have found yourself holding your breath last week while you waited for the verdict in the Derek Chauvin trial. And also like me, you may have been skeptical that the jury would find him guilty. When they did, you may have let out a sigh of relief that this time, unlike all the times before, a white cop wouldn't get away with murder. Yet it's hard to be overly enthusiastic about a jury making the only decision that they could consider the evidence. We might have been able to show a little more exuberance for the guilty verdict had yet another young Black man not been murdered the day before by another white cop a few miles away from where the trial was being held. The murder of George Floyd and the recent murder of Daunte Wright, the subsequent civil uprising and call for justice, even the sigh of relief over the conviction of Derek Chauvin, are all indicators of the systemically racist system we all live in, including our youngest children who face the worst opportunity gaps in the country from birth here in Minnesota. At Think Small, we know Black lives matter. We also know we need to fight Asian hate as we continue to fight for all the children and families in our communities. We also know that systemic racism undermines the entire educational system in Minnesota, and the gaps that start early for children persist into adulthood and affect a person's lifetime earning potential. Today is our fifth Small Talks in a series of addressing the impact of implicit bias on our children. And today we are going to be talking about solutions to closing Minnesota's persistent opportunity gaps as we talk about the intersection of race, the economy, and early childhood. Our Small Talks today will include a brief presentation from Rob Brunwald about the data from the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis on the intersection of race, economy, and education, in particular, early childhood education. After Rob's presentation, we move into a discussion with our three panelists: James Henderson, Director, First Children's Finance of Michigan; Sharia Robinson, owner of Train 'em Up Childcare; and Jonathan Palmer, Executive Director of Hallie Q. Brown Community Center. Allison Corrado, who is the Senior Program Officer of Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Minnesota Foundation, will moderate our discussion this morning that will focus on the importance of public investment in high quality early childhood education. So let's get to it. Right now, I'm going to introduce to you our speaker. It is my great honor to introduce to you Rob Brunwald. He is an economist with the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. Rob conducts research on community development and regional economic issues. He co-authored Early Childhood Development, Economic Development with a High Public Return in 2003, and he has written several subsequent articles on the economic and social impact of early learning. He frequently speaks to community and business leaders, policymakers, and media throughout the United States. Brunwald has served on several boards and advisory committees, but the most important one is that he's on Think Small's board. I'm not even going to talk about the rest. And he is also a past president of the Minnesota Economic Association. He holds a bachelor's degree in economics and religion from St. Olaf College and a master's degree in applied economics from the University of Minnesota. So please join me in welcoming Rob Brunwald.
Thank you so much, Diane, and good morning, everyone. I've got a presentation, so I'll go to the opening slide here. Thanks for the opportunity to speak with you today on racism and the economy and early childhood opportunity gaps. The Federal Reserve System comprises of the Board of Governors in Washington, D.C., and 12 regional reserve banks. The Minneapolis Fed is one of those banks. And note that my comments today are my own and not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis or the Federal Reserve System. A core part of the Fed's work in managing the flow of money and credit in the economy to achieve stable prices and maximum employment. And the second part of the Fed's dual mandate, maximum employment, is a key reason why the Minneapolis Fed has spent several years researching early childhood issues. When children start with a solid foundation during their first years of life, as adults, their employment prospects and overall economic health are stronger. We'll go to the next slide. Since the Great Recession, and even more so during the pandemic, the question of how racism and discrimination affect employment have come to the forefront of conversations within and outside the Fed. That is, it's not enough to achieve a low national unemployment rate, but rather we need employment and economic opportunities that are broadly shared across the nation. After the murder of George Floyd, the Minneapolis Fed, along with other Federal Reserve banks, started the series Racism and the Economy to investigate how racism affects different populations and the economy overall. We'll go to the next slide. The 11-part series is focusing on a number of topics. Each event includes 3 proposals on how to close disparate outcomes by race, followed by discussion among community members and experts in the field. During the education event this past January, Myra Jones-Taylor, Chief Policy Officer of 0 to 3, made a compelling case for giving parents paid family leave and predictable work schedules as a way to strengthen family economic security and leave parents better able to support their children. I'll go to the next slide. The Minneapolis Fed is publishing an article related to each of the topics with a focus on Minnesota data. The article, published along with the education event, included data on early childhood, K-12 schools, and post-secondary education options by race and ethnicity. Minnesota's racial gaps in K-12 outcomes across test scores, high school graduation rates, and college readiness are well known. In 2019, Anusha Nath, research economist at the Minneapolis Fed, and I released a report that shows that these gaps are some of the largest in the country. The information in the report also supported the Minneapolis Fed's involvement with the Page Education Amendment to make quality public education a civil right for all children in Minnesota. We'll go to the next slide. But the gaps we observe in school-age outcomes start with gaps in opportunity much earlier. One picture of the opportunity gap for young children is family median income among households with children. In Minnesota, non-Hispanic white family income is more than twice as high as Hispanic or Latino and Black or African American family income, and more than 3 times higher than American Indian family income. As discussed in the Minneapolis Fed's November article on racial disparities in Minnesota labor market outcomes, there is a large gap in earnings between white workers and Latino, Black, and American Indian workers, and systematic racism contributes to those differences. In terms of early childhood, the data start with disparities in prenatal care and birth outcomes. For example, in Minnesota, infant mortality rates for American Indian and Black children are more than twice as high as those for white children. And Minnesota-born American Indian infants and infants of color are more likely to have a low birth weight compared with white children. In terms of school readiness, nationally representative surveys of young children in 1998 and 2010 show substantial gaps in kindergarten achievement in reading and math between white and Black children and white and Hispanic children. The 2010 study shows gaps among these groups and also show gaps in these groups in self-control and approaches to learning. Between 1998 and 2010, there is some evidence that these gaps closed somewhat, but they still remain substantial. We'll go to the next slide. For Minnesota, there is more data available about outcome gaps by race and ethnicity in the K-12 system than for young children, but we do have results from a series of school readiness studies by the Minnesota Department of Education from 2006 to 2012. I think we got to go back one slide. Yeah, there we go. Actually, I think a slide might be out of order. Go ahead to 2 slides once and just see what's there. There we go. So for Minnesota, there is more data available about outcome gaps by race and ethnicity in the K-12 system, but we do have the results from a series of school readiness studies by the Minnesota Department of Education from 2006 to 2012 that indicate early differences by race. In these studies, school readiness is defined using a school readiness checklist that assesses children's physical, personal, and social development, as well as their ability to perform tasks related to the arts, language, and literacy, and math. Students are deemed school ready if they meet or exceed 75% of the possible points on the checklist. Asian, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander students had the highest rate of proficiency on the study school readiness checklist at 82%, followed by white students and Black or African American students. Native American and Latino students had the lowest proficiency rates at 62% and 68% respectively. And then if we go back one slide. When families of color do access early childhood education, their children are often subject to inequitable treatment. Think Small, led by Diane, has been a leader in highlighting and discussing bias in early care and education. As an example of racial bias showing up in national data, from 2015 through 2016, Black boys represented 19% of public preschool enrollment, but 45% of male preschool suspensions. And Black girls represented 20% of public preschool enrollment, but 54% of female preschool suspensions. So there are several takeaways from these data, including that it's not enough to only promote broad-based access to early care and education. We must look at how early childhood policy addresses equity. There are many additional resources for early care and education coming through the American Rescue Plan, and more funding is proposed in President Biden's American Families Plan. We need to listen to the leaders and early care and education providers and parents in Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities and consult applicable research about how these resources can most effectively close these opportunity gaps and achieve a high return on investment. So I'll now turn the program over to Allison.
Thank you, Rob. That was wonderful and so informative. And we're going to really get into that in a discussion that's going to be facilitated by Allison Corrado. So at this time, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's discussion. Allison Corrado is the Senior Program Officer of Blue Cross Blue Shield of Minnesota Foundation. Allison is passionate about working in partnership to advance health equity and dismantle systems of oppression. Allison's background is in social work and public policy, and she oversees the foundation's focus on increasing access to high-quality early childhood care and education. Allison is the co-chair of the Start Early Funders Public Policy Committee and a member of the Minnesota Council on Foundations Government Relations and Public Policy Committee. So please join me in a warm welcome for Allison Corrado.
Thanks, Diane, and thank you, Rob, for such a great grounding in the issue. Good morning, everyone, bright and early. I have the pleasure of introducing our fantastic panel. We have an incredibly talented panel of early childhood experts that we'll hear from today to understand more in depth the connection of how early childhood intersects with the economy and with race. And so we're going to dig into how early childhood programs are working to close opportunity gaps for kids and understand more in depth how that intersects with the economy. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists to first introduce themselves, starting with James Henderson, the Director of First Children's Finance in Michigan. Go ahead, James.
Good morning, everyone. Allison, thank you for that introduction. It's an honor to be with you today, and I appreciate Rob's insight and his data. And first and foremost, what I will say is that First Children's Finance has been in existence since 1991, and our regional and headquarters is based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I actually represent a region in Michigan. And the data that Rob is describing is very similar to what is taking place in Detroit. And it's just one of those things that in Michigan, we have 80% or more that in terms of the most segregated in terms of educational facilities and opportunity and resources for children. And then that also mirrors and echoes the quality early starts and the deficit gaps there. So I look forward to being able to discuss that in further and some of the solutions that we're bringing forward. Thank you.
Thanks, James. Next up, we have Jonathan Palmer, the Executive Director of the Hallie Q. Brown Community Center.
Thanks, Allison, and good morning, everyone. I am the Executive Director of Hallie Q. Brown Community Center. We're a 92-year-old African-American social service agency open to everyone, located in the heart of the Rondo community in St. Paul, Minnesota. We have 6 core areas, but today I'm here to talk about our early childhood program and our youth enrichment program, which actually goes back to the New Deal program. So our Early Learning Center was originally a New Deal program. So we have been around for 92 years, focusing on early childhood education and focusing on racism and adjustment for our community. So very glad to be here with everyone.
So great. And next up, we have Sharia Robinson, the owner of Train 'em Up Childcare.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Allison. I am the CEO at my own in-home childcare, Train 'em Up Childcare. I have 7 years of experience in other learning centers, and I decided to go out on my own in October of 2020, so I'm fairly new. I'm very appreciative for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks, Sharia. So we have a whole lot that we want to cover, so we're just going to jump right in. But to everyone in our audience, please feel free to put your questions in the chat as they come up. We are collecting those. We're going to do our best to cover as many of them as possible. So don't hold them till the end. Feel free to throw them in whenever a question comes to you. You know, we are over a year into the pandemic, right? And we have a ways to go to come out on the other side. And we know that the business model of childcare was struggling before the pandemic. So I'm wondering if our panel can talk about what practices that you've put into place this year just to keep the lights on and keep going. And anyone can answer that.
Well, Allison, to begin with, what I will say is you're absolutely right. If you go back to even pre-March of last year, the sector was really trying to struggle to figure out its pulse and its identity to provide quality opportunities for early starts for families and communities, especially low to moderate income communities. This pandemic actually just brought it to the nation's consciousness and the forefront. And what we've learned in particular at First Children's Finance is that the lens as to which this pandemic came forward had a lot of providers, business owners on their heels. And it just brought to the forefront the business operations side of things, coupled with sustainability. And really, whether you came into the sector as a circumstantial owner or provider, or you've had experience in terms of more than 10 years, what it taught us at First Children's Finance is we had to roll up our sleeves. We had to engage with the providers and the owners and their staff. And we really had to go into a deep dive in terms of how the business was functioning. If you actually had to close because of the pandemic and you weren't deemed an essential business, what did that mean for your tuition? What did that mean for your capacity? What did that mean for your staffing and your resources and still paying the bills? Were you in a position and place where you actually had every I dotted, every T crossed to be able to apply for PPE, for PPP, for EIDL, whatever the circumstance. And for a good majority, the answer, unfortunately, was they were not necessarily prepared right away, or they missed that front window to be able to submit for that funding or that grant relief. And they really had to examine their business operation and how they were functioning to be able to come out of this pandemic with a bright future in mind, but a sustainability model to say how they were going to continue to offer those quality opportunities for families and the communities that they served. So it really had us examining, what do we do in terms of, even in our states that we do serve, and nationally, how do we bring all this expertise, the resources, and the flexibility to connect with owners and providers, to give them the support that they need, the confidence that they need to really assess where they stand to come out of this pandemic. It's an unprecedented time, but it really did bring to the forefront the need for everybody to look at the business side of it and sustainability models.
I agree with James in terms of the analyzing the business model and looking at that. I think there was also a step before that that we encountered. You know, when the pandemic hit, nobody was expecting this. Nobody knew what to do, how to deal with it. Organizations like ours that were either serving basic needs or serving education were asked to stay open, but there were no resources initially. And that's because the funding community and the government didn't know what to do. Everybody was scrambling, trying to figure out what to do, how to adjust. And so at the earliest point in this, you're talking about March of 2020, you had organizations going ahead trying to figure out, how do you sustain this? How do you help families? Our organization stayed open the entire time, with the exception of, we had a mid-year a COVID scare that we closed down for 1 week in order to check everything, clean everything. But other than that, we actually had to convert over into a slightly different model in order to help support families. You know, our early childhood education, the Early Learning Center stayed the same, with the exception of adding more staff into that area. Our youth enrichment, the school age program, actually became a distance learning, because you have to remember, right before this, the St. Paul Public Schools were on strike. And so we already had kids who were at our center full day. And on top of that, what you then get is the systems, everybody closing down, and parents trying to figure out, what are they going to do? Essential workers, which a lot of our families are, already having their kids there. So we just shifted into incorporating the COVID restrictions. But what we also had to look at was, all right, how do we go ahead and help families? Because everything was in flux. We needed to make sure that the kids had as much stability as possible. And so it required us to shift some of our staff over to help support those programs, incorporating extra check-ins. We changed some of what we did internally in terms of social distancing and COVID restrictions. But in terms of the education piece, it was really staying with the core parts that we have and making sure that our young people had as little transition as possible, and we could help them understand why the world was going crazy and what was happening with that, and support the families. So the model piece was a piece that came a little bit later, and it was just as James said, you know, people had to figure out, what are you going to do? What are you going to change? How are you going to sustain that? But initially, it was just people, sheer force of will, sheer going ahead and pulling together and figuring out, how do we sustain our families in this time of need?
So you both talked about either engaging or supporting families and really sort of shifting how you were thinking about doing the work. I'm wondering if you could all maybe chat a little bit about what you're doing in your programs to help close the opportunity gap between white kids and kids of color in early childhood programs. Because I think of family engagement, right, or thinking about families as being whole units as being such an important piece to that.
Well, Allison, one of the things that I will say, going back to what Rob was describing with this data and the statistics, is that what we're learning now is that it's now beyond what I call the safe, nurturing learning environment, where families say, okay, it's clean, it looks good, we can drop our kids off and pick them up. It is now at a point that the bar is being raised, and even with some of the work from the Bipartisan Center and some of the work that we're doing with First Children's Finance to support some of those efforts and looking at the data that Rob is saying, we have to push deeper. In particular, in Detroit, echoing the data and statistics that Rob is saying in Minnesota, there is this deficit gap. And it's not enough to say, well, 70 or 75% are proficient or they hit the growth tiles. You now have to look at this 25 or 30% and say, what are you going to do with them? And the data is telling us that some of these children, unfortunately, have been in this lower quadrant for their entire career. So the push from K-12 is down to what you call the early sector. And the early sector is being charged with looking at the curriculum, looking at the delivery of instruction, beyond just simply having a clean, nurturing environment, but pushing to the outcomes to get these children prepared so they actually go into the K-12 sector with a strong quality start. And they don't start sometimes, unfortunately, a year to 3 years behind some of their counterparts. So that does mean pushing into not only the business operations side of it, but the educational and the quality learning opportunities that should be fostered there. It is pushing to look at how the environment is conducive for learning and working with the staff and giving them leadership and professional development and training opportunities. So they think more than just beyond a safe nurturing center, but an environment that is conducive and fosters learning and engages parents and the family overall. One of the things that we struggle with in Detroit is that we know that you have approximately 60% of our adults that are functionally illiterate. And we also have 60% that are actually unemployed right now. So when they are taking their children to a quality program, they're expecting that that program can help make up the difference in those gaps that they experience themselves for the quality start. So we have to assess low to moderate incomes and the communities where the parents and the families are coming from, and the resources and the tool and the training in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion to make sure that it's the strongest quality childcare program possible.
And from the educational standpoint, first and foremost, we're treating all our kids the same. You know, our organization is an African-American organization, but it's open to everyone. And we have a diverse set of families that come to there. The majority are African-American, but we have white families, we have Asian families, we have Latino families. And those kids all are learning together. And what that right there promotes is integration. It goes ahead and moves beyond the differences. No child is born racist. No child is born with the low self-esteem that comes from the systems that are set up not to help promote their education and promote their self-worth. And so first and foremost, we're working with those kids all together, teaching them how to interact, teaching them that they can be successful. We have teachers that reflect who they are. So the teachers in the classroom are ones that they can see themselves in. That's an essential core piece. And when we use the education programs, the materials we use reflect children of color. The materials we use reflect integration. So it helps at that early childhood stage to put the images, to put the ideas in their head, but we're also incorporating in other measures. We have created transition classrooms that help to go ahead and give some extra time. We have those rigid guidelines of this is infant, this is toddler, this is preschool, you're at this age. Not every child is ready to move up sometimes. Some are ahead of that. And so the transition classrooms go between the different sections and allow us to spend more time one-on-one with kids who may need extra help or who may be ahead of the game and help them transition up to the next level. And we're using trauma-informed care. Part of the thing that is almost seems like it's new, people are discovering the fact that trauma happens, and generational trauma has happened to kids of color, and that impacts their learning. That impacts how they are able to grow. And so understanding, training in those areas, incorporating those into the lessons allows people to stop looking at things as, oh, we've got more suspensions over here. That must be that group of kids is just a bad group of kids. No, there's trauma in that household. There's trauma in that community. what can you do to go ahead and mitigate that and help to adjust around that? And the last point I'll make around this is we also have our food shelf, and we make sure families have food. A child cannot study if they're hungry. Hunger will distract it. So we take a holistic approach in terms of the education, looking at the families. We have a community support navigator. We connect families into other resources so that we can help them all be successful.
And Allison, what I will say is, Jonathan, that's an excellent point. And thank you for bringing that up about the trauma, because in Detroit, we are really rallying behind this data. And for the last year, what we're learning from experts across the board is traditionally you have looked at between the grades of 3rd grade and 5th grade, where it has always been suspected that that's the first time that children are exposed to the traumatic events to their life and their lifestyle in their communities. The data is telling us the direct opposite now. It is hitting these children at younger and younger ages, and it is a part of some of their experiences. Unfortunately, I wish that that never happened, but it is a part of the landscape. And having that traumatic informed decision process as a part of your program and to have the outcomes of what Jonathan is saying is just absolutely paramount, to be informed, to make decisions, and to adjust your strategies to reach these kids as soon and as often as possible.
Sharia, I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to, what do we have in early childhood? What are you able to offer in your program to close opportunity gaps that might not be available once kids hit the K-12 system, right, and are part of this much broader and bigger system? What do we have available at this young age?
Yeah, I was just gonna mirror a little bit of what Jonathan was saying about trauma and behavior, about what kids are doing in their behavior is not all about them being bad. You have to examine the whole situation. You can't understand a child without understanding their parent. And so in a small family childcare, I really have good relationships with parents when we have a two-way communication where I can talk to them about what's going on at home so that I can best care for their child in the way their child needs to be cared for. I also like what Jonathan was saying about representation. So I have a lot of diversity and inclusion books. We have different things, different foods that we eat, about different cultures, just to introduce children that there's different things than what's going on at home so that they can get a broad understanding of diversity. And I think it really makes a difference. They ask a lot of questions, and then kids are actually teaching their parents. They're going home and they're talking to their parents about different cultures and different things. And I think that's the generation that we're growing up in is where our children are actually teaching the parents more things about diversity and more things about biases and microaggressions. I also have school age children that I do some social distance learning for, which was a lot of help to parents who don't have that technology savvy. I have a lot of grandparents also who are bringing their children. They have no understanding of technology, which has been very helpful. So I think it's all about generations too, and the younger generation teaching the older generation. I'm also doing a lot of resources with my families. I'm over North Minneapolis, and I dig really deep into resources to give these to parents. Like Jonathan was saying, food, if the necessary things at home are not getting taken care of, parents are stressed out. And when parents are stressed out, children are stressed out. And so just trying to make sure that families have everything that they need is what I'm trying to do here.
And Allison, one thing that I will say about this, and I appreciate both of your efforts, it's tremendous. One of the things that we're catching in Detroit and mirroring across the state too, is equal to the part of the children and the families, the staff, the teachers. Right now, we're experiencing high turnover. A lot of childcare facilities, home-based or center-based, are trying to figure out how to adjust their hours because those staff members that were champions are exhausted, and they're trying to still meet the demands and the needs of the family and the parents as they re-engage the workforce and the sector. But a lot of the teachers, the staff at the centers and businesses are saying they're exhausted. And they are also going through traumatic experiences at the same time as well as they try to navigate this landscape. And they are looking for training and resources. So Sharia, you're absolutely right. It's across the board. How do you actually get the tools, the resources for the staff, in addition to the children and the families, to show that you understand what it is that they're dealing with and to try to support that anchor for quality outcomes.
Allison, I'll just add, appreciate all of the comments so far, especially this last piece about quality. And we recognize that as we talk about quality, it costs more. We need staff that are responsive to the individual needs of children and their families. It takes more time and requires more wages in order to keep turnover rates low, keep continuity, attract qualified staff and so on. But it's all a reminder. It's something that Art Rolnick and I from the Minneapolis side we've been talking about a while, is that these investments pay off. That is, closing the opportunity gaps early in this way has a positive return to the economy, reducing future costs and also supporting the trajectory of children very early.
And we're seeing that as well in Michigan and Detroit as well, Rob, where that return in investment is directly attributing back to the long-term success of that local community and those students growing up and they're graduating or they're having success in their chosen careers. And now we're seeing data after 10 or 15 years where they're staying in that community as to which they were grown up and they were raised, and they're positively contributing. So the return on the investment is absolutely essential. And when you're talking about the aspect of wages and rates for teachers and the staff, one of the things that we do know, especially coming out of Detroit and Michigan as well, is that the longer you can maintain that quality staff and show them opportunities for growth, development, and support, the stronger your program is. And unfortunately, what's happening now too many times is that with the high turnover, directors, owners, and those that are in leadership roles in the businesses spend a considerable amount of time in what I call consistent onboarding mode, instead of really looking at being able to grow and expand their program. So looking at those wages, the opportunities for development, the opportunities for training, whether it's diversity, equity, and inclusion, and just maintaining your staff and representing them and understanding what they're going through is very much essential to the quality outcomes for a program.
The problem that I think that we run into, though, is that's the main sticking point. The data shows what is true. It's easy to look at the data and say, yep, this makes sense. You just go ahead and do this. The practicality, trying to get people to understand that investment is something that you have to do for the long term, is where the challenge comes in. And we get that where people, they're not connecting the dots. So that leaves Sharia and I in running these organizations where we've got to actually bear the brunt of that. We have to try to convince people this is a long-term investment. This is why it's important, while at the same time going ahead and running our organizations, while at the same time caring for our staff, caring for our teachers, and at the same time, in the midst of all the stuff that's going on right now, just for this last year, pandemic, systemic racism, we're dealing with all of those factors at the same time, and then have to convince people, hey, by the way, if you could put money into our teaching staff and into the training, we're going to have better long-term outcomes, while people are mad that they can't go to Chili's. So there's a disconnect that is happening here where people aren't understanding. They're looking for that immediate gratification. They're looking for I want to fund this specific part of your program, and I want to see what the results are. The holistic approach puts more pressure on early childhood providers, and especially the home-based ones, because they tend to be smaller, to have to go ahead and scramble and deal with the idea of making people aware of information that's available out there, information that they could take a look at, but we have to make the case in addition to taking all the things. So what we need is a shift in how the system looks at itself, recognizes these issues, recognizes these problems, and a shift in terms of where they're looking to do the investment, so that it takes some of the pressure off of us to have to explain why systemic racism is a key issue and has long-term effects.
Yeah, Jonathan.
Yes, I'm sorry. You're absolutely right, Jonathan. And one of the things, and Sharia, I'll certainly let you speak, but I'll just say this. And one of the things that's shifting for the both of you that we're hearing here as well too, which a lot of owners, directors, and providers never saw themselves in, is that advocacy lens, in terms of now having to be a voice and a champion to talk to legislators, policymakers, to understand the money and the amounts, where they're coming from for supporting the sector, but the reason and the rationale behind it and where it needs to go.
Yeah, I was going to say, Jonathan, thank you for bringing up the many hats that we have to wear, especially in a family childcare, where I'm trying to get starred so that I can get more investments and more education for my children. But it's almost impossible, the many hurdles that I have to go through on top of the things that I'm already doing just to give the kids the education that they need at a quality rate is a very hard thing. So thank you for bringing up the advocacy as well, James, because it is a really big deal.
Can we talk about public policy? Because I would love to hear from all of you. Sharia, maybe you could start even, because you were just talking about this, right? What is important for policymakers to know? We've got time's taken, but we've got a little more time in our legislative session. What do folks need to be paying attention to about how to support and sustain the early childhood field?
As I was saying, I think policymakers need to consider the person. I mean, we can't make one policy and have it fit everyone because everyone's needs are different. So I think policymakers need to really consider people of color and how cultures make a difference in the policies that they're making. I'll just say that to be brief.
I would say systemic racism, and that is such a key point, and we're right at the tipping point where people are starting to recognize that. It is, you look at these gaps, you look at these situations, they didn't happen overnight. These are systems built upon structures that have been in place, and revelatory information like racism exists suddenly comes to the forefront. In 2020, we're like, oh, I thought Barack Obama got elected and we were all done with this. No. These are systems that have been in place, and it doesn't matter, if you own slaves. It doesn't matter if you've never gone ahead and burned a cross or done anything like that. We have a system that's right here in place that we're all having to deal with. And so recognizing that that is a factor in this, recognizing what it is built on, is the only way we're going to be able to deconstruct that and go ahead and create solutions that will go ahead and allow children to be successful. We all want children to be successful. We want children to have a fair opportunity to be able to get out in the world and do good things. And it starts with dealing with the core issues, not just the top pieces. You've got to get down to the roots and understand what this is all built on and based on, and how these opportunity gaps came up, how these education gaps came up. Why do you have so many kids being suspended? And what is that saying about the trauma that's in the family? And what's that saying about the education professional that hasn't been trained to recognize these pieces and is put in a place where they're making judgments based upon what they found out in their small town and is not aware of what this connects into?
And Allison, what I will say, and thank you both, because you're absolutely right. When you're looking at some of the things that you're hearing, as Rob mentioned, we had the president who did his statement in terms of where his focus is going to be, in particular for childcare. You're hearing respectively that states are going to be allocated, in some respects, record amounts of funding. One of the things that we're hearing on the ground is that the providers and the owners don't feel that they're a part of this decision. They don't understand where these dollar amounts and the funding allocations are coming from. A lot of the legislators are thinking that they're doing the immense effort of being a champion for their state and get the allocation for the fundings. But you don't want it to be tied up in political ratings. You want it to be able to get down to the individual owners, the center directors, the providers, to really impact what they're trying to do for their communities and the families to which they serve. So, we at First Children's Finance have a theory of change where we look at the individual businesses, we look at regional supports, and then also the system and the advocacy piece to it. But the big thing right now is, as this funding comes out, to Jonathan's point, looking at some of the things that are implicitly there in terms of the bias and the racism. As I mentioned before, we had a situation that in Michigan where we had probably about 70% of those that were white, non-African American, Latino that qualify for the first round of the PPP in the EIDL, where we had on the other side 70% of our African American and Arabic and Latino populations that did not. And they didn't even get an answer as to why they were turned down. And, you know, just some of the structure and the awareness of getting the opportunity out there for some of these resources and the funding is a deficit gap as well. So from top down, you know, the allocations, the purpose, where the funding is intended to go, and getting it to these owners, directors, and providers so they can sustain their program is of critical importance.
I think what I'll add to these comments is, you know, first observing that the pandemic affected low and moderate income and communities of color the most, and that as we look at these additional resources through ARPA and potentially more coming down the line, is that to target these resources for those providers that are serving low to moderate income families and children from families of color. So whether that is our early learning scholarship system in Minnesota, or supporting CCAP in terms of reimbursement rates and outreach, you know, that is one side. But then also looking at where are providers that are serving more of our most vulnerable children, where we do get the highest return. And in terms of stabilization grants, can we leverage those dollars to support, you know, the programs that we're discussing here, to make them more effective and to provide the additional resources they need to support this population.
Just a reminder to folks, feel free to throw your questions in the chat, and we'll make sure that we're addressing those. Rob, I'm wondering if you can keep going on what you were just talking about, sort of, right? We've been talking about opportunity gaps and how they're really rooted in long-standing systems of oppression. I'm wondering if you can talk both a little bit about why we think academic gaps for children of color are so persistent in Minnesota specifically, what our field can do, our early childhood field can do to address those gaps and close those gaps before kids start school. And I think it connects also to this question that Bao asked in the chat around what data do we have about children in our early childhood systems, you know, separated by culture, race, ethnicity, things like that. What do we know?
So, you know, in terms of the data piece, you know, there is some information in the Minnesota early childhood longitudinal data set in terms of the take-up of programs such as CCAP or early learning scholarships by race and ethnicity. So we can see at a high level, you know, what that looks like. We don't have a consistent way of being able to measure outcomes for children as they come to our kindergarten classrooms to understand, you know, how that maps out relative to the experiences that children have early. So it's a mixed picture. And in terms of addressing systemic racism, I think the racism in the economy series that we've had at the Federal Reserve System has been helpful to really underscore statements that have been made by everyone. Jonathan made too, that systemic racism is in place at many different levels, and it has been in place for decades. So in order to look at the system and be able to turn it around, you know, we have one part of that is early care and education. We see also systemic racism in labor markets, in housing and credit access. There's other areas to look at. But within early care and education, I think that's where we can understand where can we leverage our resources to, let's say, identifying neighborhoods, communities of colors, places that are underserved, and how could we support the families and the providers in those neighborhoods. That would be an equity move. You know, for an example, not an equity move would be to take all of these additional resources that we have and give a little bit to everybody across the field. You know, in order to have a difference, we need to target and focus and make sure that they are doing something different than we have been doing for decades.
One of the things that's a real simple fix, or should be a simple fix, but it's one of those glaring things that goes below the surface, is how benefits are administered and when they cut off. One of the situations we run into is families that are on assistance that are going to school and they're getting childcare assistance so that they can go ahead and create a better life for them and their families, those benefits get cut off during school breaks. So what you have is you run into December and you get those winter breaks, that family has to pull their child out of daycare, or the daycare has to sustain and absorb that cost so that child doesn't fall behind. This is one of the key pieces that gets lost within this system, because we're talking about, well, we just need to give them this much. This is all you need, and not understanding holistically how that connects into. When you start looking at the summer break, if they're not in school for the summer, then they're going ahead and they're disrupting the educational process at one of the most critical stages for young people. So you have that piece. You also, I appreciate Rob saying that you got to look at the investment, because you have to look at the community. You know, both of our centers are community based, and they're community based dealing with the issues that are happening in community. I mean, Sharia is up in North Minneapolis, we're in St. Paul, but both of us are in locuses of really deep disparity and dealing with the issues of systemic racism on a daily basis. And there's not an understanding for that. There's not an investment that goes in for that. So understanding, as we're trying to level the playing field, as we're trying to go ahead and ensure that our young people have that opportunity, recognizing the long-term impacts. And again, getting at that core root problem instead of just the surface is where we're going to see the greatest return on investment.
There's a question in the chat specifically around different models of childcare, right? So this is asking specifically around childcare cooperatives as a model. So I'm wondering if you would speak a little bit to different models of childcare and what we're learning as we sort of come out on the other side of COVID. And how does this connect to maybe a broader vision of what does childcare look like in the future? What does our system of early childhood need to look like as we move forward?
Well, one of the things, Allison, that I will say that's coming out of this pandemic is that you're getting a new sense of an undercurrent of innovation. And I think right now, some of the home-based in particular are really examining either do they want to merge into a center? Are they looking at maybe trying to pull together other resources? And you're hearing some innovative models that are coming out of what you're talking about by this co-op design. Maybe not in isolation, perhaps maybe in a center that has other supports and, you know, social determinant supports and resources. So you're hearing some innovation, and you're trying to figure out strategy-wise how to actually pull together the resources, to Jonathan's point, understanding the community, low to moderate income that you're serving, to try to make yourself more enticing for resources and for funding, but then necessarily trying to figure out how to really bring what you call together this super cooperative or this cohort model of learning in a child center where you're not necessarily isolated. So you're looking at the aspects, and it's early on because we're still on the throes of coming out of what I call post-pandemic, but we're not quite yet there. But there are some innovative models that are being looked at and discussed about what the new face of childcare could look like by bringing together resources, those that have skill sets that don't necessarily want to be by themselves, but to try to bring forward quality options.
I just want to read this.
Go
ahead, Rob.
Just one comment is, you know, it's clear from the research that the environment, that a positive and healthy environment for children can be offered in many different types of settings. It's really that interaction and the environment, the interaction between caregivers and children that create that education, that developmental benefit. And so models on the business side that help sustainability are important, but I think we need to, you know, understand quality can happen anywhere.
That's right. I just wanted to read this quote that was in the chat that says, "We need to hear more from providers like Sharia more and more, and pay them for their time educating us about the actual work." So I'm just gonna applaud that comment. You know, we have time, I think, for one more question, and then we'll wrap this up. The question is, if the gaps in brain development occur during the first 1,000 days of a child's life, how can we direct resources to families and children before the age of 3?
I think the overall flow of resources had been, nationally have been focused on preschool 3 and 4, and then starting to move into 0 to 2, but there was no reason it had to follow that path. Resources can go to younger children to help support their environments clearly.
And I'll echo that as well, Allison. What the data is telling us, as we were saying earlier in our conversation, the K-12 push is now pushing further and further down. And as this data becomes more available, it's how often, how consistent, how early can you get the resources and the training and the access and the awareness for families to the point that the person who posted that raised. We now know this data, which we didn't necessarily know before. It is about marketing, it is about promoting, it is about awareness, but it is also coupled with the qualified staff, the training, and the access to resources to be able to push further and further down for, again, a quality start that's not just centered on a safe nature, environment, but a conducive environment for learning as well.
I would say just do it. I mean, you're asking, how can we do it? Just do it. This is the priority. Move the focus towards that. Understand what is going on. And if you're not sure, come look at what Sharia and Hallie and other organizations are doing. Come take a look. I mean, not right now because COVID, but talk to us. Hear about the results. We go ahead and we work with children that the personal care that Sharia and our organization give to them, help them be successful. We have kids that they come in and we're told they're a problem kid. They're one of these that disrupt the things. No, what happens is you've got to recognize the individual uniqueness that that child has. There's triggers that come up. We have a student who they believe in fairness. So if you're talking to them about their behavior, but there's another student who did the same kind of thing, and they know that, and you're not addressing that, they're not going to hear that. But if you're talking to the group as one unit and saying, this is how we behave appropriately, this is the thing, that's when it triggers right in for them. So you've got to work one-on-one with young people. You've got to understand their specific development. It is not cookie cutter. You cannot go ahead and take young people who develop differently, who have different homes, who have different experiences. Somebody mentioned ACEs earlier. That's a great component. You've got to tailor it to them specifically. And when you talk about, the individualized education plan stuff, that comes later. Start earlier dealing with the issues right now, not as a special means to redress things, but as a special way to help them develop. Not everybody wants to be a football player. Not everybody wants to be a CEO. Talk with that young person and find out what they're passionate about, find out what their learning style is, and focus in on that. And you'll see the results for that first 1,000 days.
Any final words, Sharia?
Yeah, I was just gonna say we need to put some finances towards teaching parents, even in pregnancy, about attachment and about breastfeeding and the importance that it has for infants to develop long term. I think there's not enough education for our young mothers of color to know about things like that. Attachment is a very big deal moving forward. So I think if we can get some education early on with parents that are pregnant, that will be a very beneficial thing too for the community.
Wow, I feel like we are just getting this conversation going and we have to cut it off. I just want to thank all of you for an excellent conversation this morning. Allison Corrado, thank you for moderating this panel. Rob Brunwald, thank you so much for presenting your data and information. James Henderson, thank you. We just kind of met, but thank you for tuning in from Michigan and really sharing your insights about what's happening there, as well as how to support providers. Jonathan Palmer, thank you so much for talking about what is happening in St. Paul and really what we need to focus on. And Sharia, thank you as well for talking about your program and what we need and how we need to support providers. Audience, I want to thank you for getting up early with us and being open to learning how you can help tear down policies and look at the policies and practices in your own organizations and communities. Thank you so much. I also want to share with everyone a new resource in racism. You see up here, there's I've started a new podcast with Little Moments Count and NPR called Early Risers, and it's all about how to talk with children, young children, about race and racism. So I hope you join me in listening with that. You can catch it wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for Early Risers. And once again, I would like to thank our sponsors, Sleep Number, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Minnesota Foundation, and Stone Ridge Software for their generous contributions to our program. We appreciate your feedback and encourage you to share your thoughts with us in an evaluation survey that you will receive. And as always, later this Small Talks presentation will be up on our website. Be sure to join us next time for Think Small Institute's Small Talk. Thank you, everyone.